Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Jen O'Brien. I'm the Director of Off-Campus Outreach and Communication here at Miami. Before we jump into things, can someone write in the chat box to make sure that everyone can hear okay? And if you cannot hear, I guess you would have no reason to write in the chat box. So if you can just write like a yes, you can hear, that'd be great. Cool. Okay, great. So like I mentioned, I'm Jen O'Brien. I'm the Director of Off-Campus Outreach and Communication here at Miami. And that means I work with not only the students who have moved off campus and are currently living in the city of Oxford, but also that I work with students as they're planning to make that move off campus. So finding houses, signing leases, and so on. So I want to start by thanking you for spending some time with us today over lunch hour, and thanks to Mark Pontius, who's here in the room and answering your chat box questions, for coordinating the logistics and allowing us to be here today. See if this works. Okay, so here is what we're planning to cover today. We are going to focus on the process of finding housing and signing leases. So if you're the parent of a student who's already signed for next year or the following year, you can view the webinar that I did back in August, which focuses on moving off campus. I'm going to start by talking about the lease signing timeline, because it's one of the things that I get the most questions from parents and family members about, and mainly when should a student sign a lease for their junior year. And before we get into that answer, so you can understand a little bit more about the culture of signing leases in Oxford, we're going to talk about some of the history and some of the quirks of the Oxford housing market that you don't find everywhere. So we do have a little bit of a peculiar market here in Oxford where there hasn't really been a central place for students to find out about their options for off-campus housing. So for many, many years, students kind of used each other and upper-class students to learn about that process. We still hear frequently that students feel a little blindsided when they come back from winter break their first year on campus, and there's kind of a flurry of activity with people signing leases for junior year, and many students just don't feel comfortable and don't have time to really understand their options before they succumb to that pressure and sign a lease, this year for something that won't be for 2 years in advance. So we're working hard all the time to correct some of those rumors and the misperceptions out there that there's a housing shortage, and over the next few slides, we'll share some of that information. So one of the things we hear all the time from students, and you may have already heard the same thing from your student, is that, quote unquote, everyone signs a junior year lease during their freshman year. We know this from survey data over the past 2 years that really less than half of first year students sign before their sophomore year. So there are plenty of students who will wait, and that's a perfectly acceptable course of action. So a little bit more about this shortage mentality. There are 17,000 permitted spots in Oxford. Miami has 19,000 students in Oxford, including grad students. Many of them obviously live in the residence halls. And permanent residents who rent in Oxford as well, but the numbers of those is definitely in the minority of renters in Oxford. So as for the right, quote unquote, right time to decide, there isn't one. It definitely depends on where and what type of housing your student is looking for, their roommate situation, how comfortable you and they are with the entire process. So basically, as long as first-year students continue to sign leases this far in advance, there will be some housing options, primarily houses with high occupancy limits that are near campus and really near uptown. Those kinds of options will be taken off the market a little bit earlier than the others. Am I back? Can you all hear me? All right, I got word that some people were not able to hear, so we dialed back in and are using a hard line now. All right, so moving on, here's a little bit more about when people sign leases, and you can kind of see that females are a bit more likely to sign a lease that first year than males, so the females may be driving a bit of this lease signing so early. A lot of the data that you are seeing today is from a survey that was sent to all off-campus juniors last spring. We had about a 16.5% response rate, and most of the numbers that you'll see here is really consistent with our 2016 numbers. It was many of the questions were repeated from the previous year, so we could get a little longitudinal data as well. So obviously when you're signing 18 to 20 months before move-in, there are some problems that can arise in that amount of time. So I've heard of some students or their roommates transferring or dropping out of Miami for medical reasons, or missing out on study abroad internship opportunities, not being able to be a resident assistant here on campus because, you know, they've signed a lease too early. So biggest piece of advice is to know your situation, for the students to know their situation as early as possible and before signing a lease. So if they're thinking about studying abroad or taking an internship, they should, you know, figure out those plans first before signing something for 18 or 20 months down the road. So here's a breakdown of the students' list for needing a sublease tenant. I think this is from data from 100 students about 1 year ago, so pretty recent data, and those issues range from study abroad, which is by far the most common reason, and roommate issues is another reason, and then people graduating early or late. So you may not know by February of your sophomore year that you can graduate a semester early when you're a senior. So when those types of situations arise, you should know, and the students should know, that you're not entirely out of luck. So even if you have a signed lease, subleasing is very common in Oxford, and students sublease their apartments or house to other students whose circumstances may have also changed. That happens all the time. So a couple of quick tips. Absolutely be sure to check the lease to make sure that subleasing is allowed, and it almost always is, but sometimes there is a cost associated with it. So some landlords will charge a fee for a sublease tenant and kind of changing the lease over from one name to another. I also have noticed from my work here at Miami that it's a little harder to find a sublet in the spring than in the fall, and I have a couple of reasons that I suspect for this. One is that people try to give themselves plenty of time when planning those study abroad trips to find a sublease. So they'll think, hey, you know, I'll study abroad in the spring semester. That'll give me way more time to find a sublease tenant. But, you know, fewer people are looking for a room during the spring semester. So if you're strictly going by subleasing, think about finding a study abroad program or an internship that's in the fall rather than the spring, because there are more people also looking for a room in the fall. A lot of that comes from a few or a decent number of students who need to stick around for a semester longer than they thought they would need to do kind of an extra semester for graduation requirements. So more subleases are needed in the fall, but fewer are available. Definitely plan ahead as well. Let your roommates know of any plans you might have to not be in Oxford for a semester before you sign that lease. So you may be able to work something out where you can sign a short-term lease or split a lease with somebody who you know is going to study abroad on kind of the alternate semester that you are, so that your student's not having to find a sublease kind of last minute. We do have a couple of resources for subleasing and for helping students find sublease tenants. We work with a third-party vendor to offer a listing service. It's a website where you can find active off-campus housing listings, and there's also a place where students can post their own subleases for free, and then a roommate section where they can find potential roommates and whatnot. I'll talk a little bit about that later as well. I recommend also just getting the word out as widely as possible. So students can post about sublease opportunities in their Class of Facebook group. That's a good place to start. And lots of rental companies actually keep their own list of subleases available in their office or on the website, so check with them, before putting it out there to the Facebook group even. So I already talked a little bit about some consequences of not being able to find a sublease. Obviously, the student may have to pay for a semester where they're not living there. They may have to pay to find a sublease. Even if they do find a sublease tenant, there might be a fee there. You may have to have the student cancel their plans. I've heard of students not being able to take an internship or study abroad because they couldn't find a sublease tenant, and they just missed that opportunity. There's also some element of the unknown. So, the less time that the student has to find someone to take over a sublease, the less time the roommates have to kind of get to know that person and to vet them to make sure that they're someone that everyone is comfortable with. So again, we can't tell you when it's right for your student to sign the lease. If they have their heart set on a particular house or an uptown apartment and they feel really confident in their decision, they may have to sign early to nab that place, but if they wait, they're definitely not going to be without options. I have a couple of quotes throughout the presentation from students who took that survey that I mentioned back in May of 2017. This one said, they went to study abroad in the fall and they weren't able to find a subleaser, so they had to pay for the room while they were gone. They would, if they would have signed later, and they would have known at that point that they were going abroad and not have to lose that financial commitment. Another quote from a Miami junior: "It's an uncomfortable situation, had to pay for a semester even though they were abroad." Again, so that is more common than you might think, where there are rooms just sitting empty in Oxford because a sublease tenant wasn't able to be found. All right, so we're going to talk a bit about housing options and the pros and cons of different types of options in the Oxford market in particular, and then in broader terms as well. So this probably isn't much of a surprise, but we do have houses in Oxford, pass-down houses, and non-pass-down houses, and I'll explain that in just a second. Apartments that are uptown, kind of like boutique-style, higher-end options, and then complexes, larger with lots of amenities that are in the surrounding areas. Another option for affiliated men is fraternity chapter houses. We're not going to spend too much time on that option because it's less likely to apply to everyone here, and another office really handles those types of questions, so I'm definitely not an expert in that area. Pass-down houses, for those who aren't familiar with that term, they are probably another quirk of the Oxford market. So some students who are involved in a student organization, maybe an athletic team or a Greek organization, they live together as a group of friends for a year or two, and then when the time comes for the property manager to start looking for new tenants, the property manager will send a notice to the group saying, hey, if you want to keep this within your organization, or even if it's just a friend group, we'll give you the chance to let us know who the new tenants are going to be before we open it up to other students. So a lot of students take advantage of that, and they can keep their house in the family, if you will, by passing it down to underclassmen. So that's a pass-down house, which I'm not sure if that exists in other communities, but you definitely see it here. So I mentioned before that there are over 17,000 rental beds in Oxford. That's broken out a little bit further here by occupancy in houses versus apartments. And what's missing from the infographic-y type area is the list of fraternity chapter house beds. So that's about 1,214 extra beds for fraternity chapter houses. Apartments are the most common type of rental housing in the city, and houses are a little bit fewer and far between, although they're still, 6,900 beds in houses. Now these numbers are pulled from the City of Oxford website. So obviously there are a lot of reasons why a student might be interested in a house. For one thing, there's more space, more outdoor room for visitors. Houses often have a larger living area for guests than apartments. There's also curbside recycling offered in Oxford for houses, and that's not always the case in apartments. Some complexes will provide recycling options, but a lot of them really don't. It's nice to be in a residential neighborhood, especially if you're a little bit farther from uptown. The houses can be a little bit more of a like a neighborhood where you have friendly people across the street and can kind of build a little bit of a community there. But as with anything, there are cons to houses as well. Houses can be a little bit older than the apartments in Oxford, so they may need some more maintenance. And if you're renting a house, you're in charge of the yard work and shoveling snow and that type of thing. Utility costs tend to be a little bit higher in houses, and we'll go over costs in a bit. Because they're a little bit older, maybe they are a little less efficient in heating and cooling, so that might raise the monthly cost a little bit. Parking isn't always guaranteed with houses. I definitely see there to be street parking is a problem in Oxford, and if you can find off-street parking, I think that's a great amenity. Also, if you're in a house, the students are in charge of the litter on their lawn, so no matter how it got there, they are responsible for cleaning it up immediately, and the Oxford Police Department definitely will ticket for litter. That's a pretty common citation in the city. So in an apartment, you don't always have that outdoor space to enjoy, but the students also don't have as much responsibility for that space, so they don't have to worry about snow shoveling, which is nice, or cutting the grass and that type of thing. Some of the larger complexes have really amazing amenities, kind of like resort-style pools and gyms and tanning and printing centers, movie rooms, all kinds of things. Every time a new complex is built, I'm amazed at what comes up. Parking can be very plentiful in some of the complexes, or still be a bit of an issue in some of the more boutique-style uptown apartments. So definitely have the student pay attention to what parking is available as they're looking and comparing their options. There could be a bit more of a community feel in an apartment where the students can run into people in the hallways and get to know their neighbors since they're in closer proximity. But of course, in an apartment, you are much closer to your neighbors, so if you have noisy neighbors above or below or near you, it's noticeable and annoying. Of course, decorating restrictions can be in houses as well, but apartments sometimes have a little bit stricter rules about that. So here's some safety measures, and I share this with you to, less to show you which types of housing have these safety measures, but more to tell you that, these types of things seem like basic necessities, and your student should ask the question of what's available, make sure that they're advocating for themselves in some cases when certain safety measures aren't provided. Word of caution here, this is taken from survey data from, self-reported from students, so they may not be aware of all the safety measures in their apartments, even if they are, or houses or apartments, even if they are offered. I hear students cite location as their absolute #1 priority in selecting their off-campus residence. So some students care that it's really near campus or near the bus stop or the rec or uptown, or a lot of people just make decisions based on where their friends are living. So location is obviously something that will play a role in that decision. Here's a pretty rudimentary breakdown of the districts that students live in, missing several of the complexes that are located just outside the square mile of campus. Some of those large complexes that are a bit removed, although everything is within 1 mile, they provide a shuttle service to and from the campus or are near the bus stop. So it's kind of just an idea of where the students live primarily in the city. So next up is roommates, and I don't think anything is groundbreaking in this section, but it's important to cover. There are some, again, additional resources for you. So one of the other top requirements that students think of when they're searching for housing is the number of roommates that the unit can accommodate. Students get their friends and roommates together first, and then they try to find a place to live after that. That's pretty common. So this list on the City of Oxford website is really helpful. If you have a chance to screenshot or bookmark that site, it's really helpful because it is a list of all the rental properties in the city that have been issued permits. The list also designates which permits have been issued based on full inspection, and that means interior and exterior inspection of the property, and which permits have been issued based solely on like a plain view exterior property instead of the full. So that's a pretty helpful list. It really gives you an idea of how many options are in Oxford and where they're located and that type of thing. So here's the breakdown of the occupancy broken down by number of units off of that same list that the city provides. If your student is looking with 3 other people, so they need a unit for 4 students, they probably have the most options out there. There is some Oxford zoning that prohibits more than 4 unrelated people to live in a single-family rental unit. Now you'll notice here that we do have some units that permit 5 or more tenants, and those are typically permitted as lodging houses. That basically just means they were grandfathered in before that ordinance was passed several years ago. So there are actually many more opportunities for students to live in larger groups than this list would indicate. There are a decent number of houses in Oxford that have been converted to 2 or 3 family homes. So there are separate entrances and dividers. Each one is permitted for 4, but you know, the single structure can really accommodate 8 or 10 or 12 people, so a larger group can live there. So if your student is looking in a group of 8 or 10, you know, there are more than necessarily than the 82 for 8, for 6 to 8, or 27 for 9+. So this probably isn't brand new information, but of course, being best friends with someone doesn't necessarily equate to being an ideal roommate. So more important than friendship is living with someone who is compatible with the student's lifestyle. A little bit more about that. Few things roommates should discuss before signing a lease together. I'm sure you all, as parents and family members, are well aware that living with someone can be very difficult if you do not agree ahead of time on some of these options. I really recommend encouraging your student to work out a roommate agreement prior to move-in. Those conversations that they might have about overnight guests or chores, washing the dishes, locking the doors, that is so much easier to have before there's an issue than after. So, of course, you know, I tell this to students and I get eye rolls. You'll probably say the same thing and get eye rolls back, but it's definitely worth bringing up with them because, I mean, the number of calls I get regarding roommate issues, they clearly are not having these discussions before moving off campus, and it is extremely important. So a few quotes from students. I didn't know that the house I was moving into was going to be a party house. I hate trying to sleep when there's a party. And another student wrote, by the third year, you learn that one of the most important factors to an enjoyable living experience are roommates you know and trust. So definitely another reason why it's helpful to wait a little bit longer before signing that lease to make sure that your roommates are someone that, you know, the students are comfortable with and they trust and know that they can live with and get along with. So let's talk a bit about cost. So again, another kind of strange thing about the Oxford rental market is how students are charged for rent. So almost all, and it's almost 94% of the local houses charge a semester rate instead of a monthly rate. And almost half of the apartments charge that same way. That might be strange. It definitely was strange to me when I first came to Oxford and learned about it. But there are pros and cons to paying per semester. One of the pros is that you get it all done with. You don't have to worry about it each month. You do have to come up with a much larger sum of money all at once, and it, you know, that is due a month or two before move-in. So for the whole semester, and then you're typically paid in full for the year by December or January. So I think there are pros and cons to that, but I definitely find it more difficult to compare, and I think a lot of parents and family members do as well, with their own rental experience. So it's hard to compare $3,500 per semester to the the monthly mortgage that you pay or the monthly rental payment that you've paid in the past. Again, those numbers are from that survey to juniors. So here's the breakdown of utilities a little bit more. Again, self-reported data from students. I think it's just helpful to know ahead of time what kind of utility bill to expect when signing the lease and moving in, so you can budget for that ahead of time. Obviously, the apartments include many more utilities than the houses do, at least on average. So something to consider as you're comparing costs. If a house rental payment is much lower, that may be because, you know, the utilities are on top of it and not included. So just making sure that you understand all of your costs before signing. So here's the rent broken down per person, per semester, or month. Another probably a good one to screenshot if you are interested in referring back to this information later. Again, self-reported data from students, but it's very similar to the 2016 numbers as well. So I think these are a pretty good picture of what the rental market looks like. So if houses tend to be a little bit less than apartments when charging a semester rate, and a little bit more than apartments when charging a monthly rate. But that should give you an idea of what to expect ballpark. Now the range is much lower and much higher than that, so that is an average. All right, few questions that you should ask about leases and especially with costs and some of the nitty-gritty. It's for the length of the lease, it's very typical for leases to coincide with the academic year. In fact, every year I have property managers call and ask, you know, when is the year going to be over for Miami students in 2020 or 2021? So they base their leases on when Miami students will be here. So a lot of it's mid-August to mid-May, and students should take note if they're summer housing storage or what subleasing opportunities might be here if they have a full year lease and they will not be here in Oxford over the summer. This is anecdotal, but from my experience, it tends to be houses are primarily August to May, and some of the larger apartments are full year or 11-month leases. So just make sure the student knows what the length of the lease is, obviously, before signing. Obviously, you want to know if you're paying per semester or per month, and you'll want to budget accordingly for that. The safety deposits or security deposit is another thing that varies widely, and as far as the cost and the deadline of those, it's often at signing that the security deposit is due. Students should also really make sure they understand how to get the full amount back after that lease is up, and obviously read the lease really carefully to make sure that they are following it and not going to lose that security deposit. As far as parent signatures, about 47% on that survey that I keep mentioning, 47% of students said that their lease required a parent signature, and 39% said no signature was required, and about 14% did not know if a signature was required or not. So it's not uncommon for leases to require a parent guarantor. So every year I can expect in August, right after move-in, that I'll get an onslaught of phone calls from students and parents who are unsatisfied with their off-campus rental when they move in. And I'm always surprised by the number of people who signed their lease before ever stepping foot on the property. So we definitely recommend that you visit the property and that the students visit their actual unit, if possible, before signing their lease. I've heard of some students who sign early or just visit the property and then sign the lease the same day. Tell your student, if possible, to request the lease ahead of time so that you can take a look and ask, prepare some questions with them to ask the landlord as they're touring the property. Another option would be to check it out online. A lot of the property managers will keep a lease on their website, like as a sample, so you can review it with your student ahead of time, make sure that they're armed with the right questions, and if it's a high-pressure situation and they're expected to sign right away, they should have at least let you look at the lease as a parent before signing the lease. Definitely make sure the students feel comfortable with the area. Do they feel safe? And having them visit during the day and at nighttime to see how the lighting is in that area, if they feel safe walking around. Great idea to just talk to the current tenants about their experiences, if they can swing that, if they can find out who lives there. A lot of times, I think the students know where each other live off campus or can talk to people about that. The students should be comfortable with the property in its current condition. So, you know, a verbal promise from a property manager will never hold up in court. So even if there's a promise that something will be fixed, or they're getting new carpet or new floors, or, you know, whatever, the student should prepare themselves to live in that unit as is, even if none of those changes are made. Unless something's in the lease and signed by both parties, it's definitely not a guarantee. Let's see. Clearly you care about where the laundry facilities are. Is it in the unit itself? Is it in the building? Are they non-existent? They'll have to rely on laundry facilities. Make sure that they find out who's responsible for maintenance, who has in charge of snow shoveling, that type of thing. And then, of course, you just want to have them get a vibe on the landlord. Does it seem like they can get along? Another resource will be current tenants on that one. Another advice from a Miami student, so again from that survey, tour as many properties as possible. Tour them again before you actually move in. That's great advice. This person knew the people living in the apartment before them, so they got access ahead of time to take pictures and got advice on what to bring, that type of thing. All right, so on to lease signing. I am not sure all students understand this when they sign it, and I get the feeling, you know, when I say leases are legally binding, it's a contract, I get the feeling some students hear it and think, okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, I get it. But if something comes up out of my control, I'm sure the landlord will understand. And I hear that story all the time from students and even parents about something that has come up, and then long story, and then a quote, and the landlord won't let me out of my lease. And I'm always surprised to hear that, because the landlord absolutely does not have to let you out of the lease, except for a few narrow exceptions, and it has typically nothing to do with the landlord or the fact that there's a medical withdrawal or a transfer to another college or whatever the case may be. So thank you in advance, parents and family members, for anything you can do to make sure your students understand this. So many of the leases in houses and uptown apartments have joint and several liability in the lease. This is not specific to Oxford at all. You can see it in college towns across the country. But to break it down, what that means is that basically all roommates are equally responsible for paying all of the rent, and you all get in trouble, or you could be sued if one of you breaks the rules. So if there is any amount of rent due, even if it's because one student transferred and skipped out on the payment, the landlord can go after that rent from all of the roommates. On the plus side, there are definitely plus sides to this as well. You have joint control with your roommates on who lives there. On an individual lease, you may have new roommates added who you aren't necessarily comfortable with, because the lease is just between you and the landlord. So in an apartment complex that has individual leases, you're only responsible for your own rent, but on the other hand, you know, they may put someone in your second bedroom if you have a roommate who moves out, and you might not have any say over who that person is. So I always tell students to read every single line of the lease and make sure that they understand it. Leases can be tricky for anyone to understand, but especially for an 18-year-old, a first-year student who has no experience signing contracts or living in their own place, living off campus. The university currently doesn't have any type of lease review or student legal services that works with students on leases. So while we are investigating that possibility, we definitely hope that parents can be a helpful resource to students as they navigate that process. I have a little bit of information about security deposit. The average for a house for a security deposit is $779, again, according to that survey from last year, and the average for an apartment is $544, and those are both per person. Some common things that you'll see in Oxford leases, keep in mind, obviously the students should, and you should read the lease that you're thinking about signing to make sure you know what types of things are included in your particular lease. This is not a tell-all list, but there's some like rules on the thermostat over break. It can obviously save money on your utilities if you lower the temperature of your thermostat, but parents, probably you all know that in a cold weather environment, the pipes can burst and cause lots of damage. That actually happened several times over this past winter break because of how cold it was in Oxford. So make sure that the thermostat is set to a certain degree, and that will at times be actually designated what degree it should be set at in the lease. A lot of the times the landlord will say that the light bulbs and smoke alarm batteries, minor like toilet clogs and that type of thing, those are the tenant's responsibility. Already mentioned about the parent signature. I've seen this a lot where bed bug extermination costs are the tenant's responsibility. And in cases when it's not, it has to be any type of infestation of bugs or rodents or anything has to be reported as the second you notice it, so that it's as close to the original infestation as possible, and they can determine kind of whose fault it is. Many leases won't allow pets, and the leases that do allow pets will sometimes have kind of a fee associated with that. There are also some behavioral clauses on no kegs or smoking in the house and not allowed on the roof, no candles. Some of those leases that have these types of addendums will charge a per instance violation fee, like a fine for breaking that part of the lease. I've also seen like limits on the number of guests you can have over and that type of thing. Some will require that you have rental insurance. I've also seen covenant not to sue, which means lessees agree that they will not sue the landlord or the management company or participate in any class action suit against them, and they require that alternative dispute resolutions are used instead, which basically means it can't be resolved through a trial jury, but like a resolution process involving mediation. All right, so you should now have a wealth of information about the housing process, and I have some additional resources for you that will probably help throughout the decision making. One is the Express Meal Plan. I think I got this question at last year's webinar, so wanted to make sure I covered it this year. Off-campus students do have an option for a meal plan. It's very basic. It's just a declining balance. You choose how much money you want to put on it for the student or for them to put on themselves. I think it starts at a minimum of $100, and one benefit is that you save 6.5% on tax, and it does transfer year to year, semester to semester, as long as the student is still at Miami. It is non-refundable, however, so if they graduate from Miami and have a balance, they would lose that. It's not refundable to cash back to you. You can sign up through MyCard. All the information that you need is on this miamioh.edu/mealplans website. This is why we had the webinar today. We wanted to make sure we got it in before the off-campus housing fair next week. The housing fair is Tuesday, February 6th from 1 to 4, and it's in Armstrong East Wing Atrium. And this year we're really excited that we are also partnering with the Office of Residence Life for the Adulting Fair. So that will provide some additional educational opportunities for students, and there will be kind of different stations for home repair, paying utility bills, home security, we'll be giving out like free light timers for breaks, little tool sets. We'll talk about energy efficiency, reading a contract and lease documents, a bit about grocery shopping, that type of just kind of fun educational opportunities that we thought would be helpful for students who are planning their move off campus. So this event is sponsored by the Associated Student Government, My Office Off Campus Outreach, and Residence Life. Another brand new opportunity that is launching next week, by the end of next week, with an online workshop is the Tenant Education Program. So it's basically like an online class. It's completely optional, but it's about lease signing and moving off campus, living off campus, so students will be better prepared to sign leases, to be a good neighbor, to be a responsible community member, that type of thing. And then once completion of that workshop is satisfactory, completed, and they have to pass some quizzes to get to the end, they'll earn a certificate that they can present to some participating landlords on incentives. So we're really excited about that. It's going to be a lot of the information that you've all learned today, but more toward a student voice. And I think it's going to be just helpful for students to have all of this information at their disposal in one place. So that's coming out next week. If you think your student might benefit from that, you can send them to the off-campus website, miamioh.edu/offcampus. And again, we hope to launch that by the end of next week. Another great resource is this off-campus housing service that I mentioned at the beginning. It's maintained by a third-party vendor called Off-Campus Partners, LLC, and it's a wealth of information about your options off campus. It doesn't contain all the options. It's probably the most central spot for starting an off-campus housing search. One thing to note, Miami does not endorse, we don't guarantee the listings, we don't inspect them, verify them, etc. But it is a really helpful resource that is offered to students for free and to parents to look at their options. I have a couple of screenshots here too. So this is kind of the front page. You can search for how many bedrooms you want or bathrooms you want, the minimum and maximum price. You can filter even further by distance from campus, what month the lease starts in, if it's a short-term lease or a long-term lease, amenities, parking, I mean, all kinds of different ways that you can search for those different options and then get the filtered results. There's some resources on here as well that I encourage students to check out about planning the move, moving off, and then before signing a lease at all. There's also a roommate search function. This is not from our actual site because I didn't want to ruin anyone's privacy. This is from the demo version, but students can post a profile about themselves and whether or not they've already secured housing or are still looking for housing, and then look for people who they think they might get along with or who have the kind of place that they're looking for, and just identify each other that way. So lots of people have found roommates through that service, and definitely a really helpful tool. If you still need more information, you can reach out to my office, Off-Campus Outreach and Communication. The Associated Student Government is a student organization, and they have a Secretary for Off-Campus Affairs who works to plan the housing fair, and he oversees 16 off-campus senators. They do a lot with the community of Oxford as well. And then, of course, the City of Oxford is another resource that obviously they work with both renters and with students who are moving off campus, and with landlords and property managers, and kind of have a full picture of what happens here in Oxford. So I think that is it. Mark's written down a couple of questions for me already. I'm going to start taking those, but feel free now to ask questions through the chat box, and I will address as we get them. So the first question is, if students want to drive to campus, where do they park? And I want to recommend that they don't drive to campus. Most of the city is on or near a bus route, which is free to all Miami students with their student ID card. That's the BCRTA. And then some of the locations that are even further from campus down south have their own shuttles that take students to campus. The issue with parking on campus is that student parking is located on the outskirts of campus. It's where commuters park, who drive to campus every day, and where off-campus students will park as well. And you really almost need to take a bus anyway to get from those satellite lots to the center of campus. So there are a few meter options on campus, but they're not really good options because they're 1-hour meters, and classes are longer than 1 hour. Typically, if you want to park, get to your class, and then get back to it, the meter is going to be expired. And we have some very vigilant enforcers in our parking office. Any other questions? I guess I also want to reinforce that the slides will be sent to everyone who has attended today, and this session is being recorded. There will be a link posted on the Parent-Family website, Parent-Family Programs website. All right. Sounds like we have no other questions, and I think that's it. So thank you so much for coming today. Again, if you have questions that come up later, Mark's writing something down now, but if you do have questions that come up later, you can feel free to reach out to Mark in the Parent-Family Programs office or myself. Again, my name is Jen O'Brien, and I'm in Off-Campus Outreach and Communication. So thanks for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday.